To understand what happened in that house on Saratoga Trail, you have to understand what the Watts family looked like from the outside, because from the outside, they looked like a dream. Shanann Watts grew up in North Carolina. She was the kind of person who filled a room, loud in the best way, magnetic, relentlessly positive. She had been through real hardship, a diagnosis of lupus, a financial crisis so severe that she and Chris once filed for bankruptcy. But Shanann had a gift for reinvention. She found it through a company called Thrive, a direct sales health and wellness brand, and she threw herself into it completely. By 2018, Shanann had over 80,000 Facebook followers. She posted videos of her morning routine, her products, her children, her husband. She was building something, a brand, a community, an income. She was 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's third child, a boy they were planning to name Nico. Chris Watts was quieter, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in an unremarkable way. He'd grown up in North Carolina too, which is how they met. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a job that paid well. He coached the girls' soccer teams. He did the grocery runs. From the outside, Chris was the steady one, the rock behind Shanann's spotlight. They had moved to Colorado for a fresh start after their financial troubles. They bought a house they couldn't quite afford, $400,000 with a $3,000 monthly mortgage, betting on Shanann's business growing fast enough to cover it. And for a while, the bet seemed to be paying off. In the spring of 2018, Shanann went to a Thrive conference in Arizona. While she was gone, Chris began an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. Kessinger was 29, recently out of a long-term relationship, bright, athletic. She and Chris began spending their lunches together, then their evenings, then their nights at her apartment. Chris told her things about his marriage that painted Shanann as the problem: controlling, difficult, emotionally exhausting. Whether or not any of it was true almost doesn't matter. What matters is that Chris Watts was building a second life. By summer, Shanann had sensed something was wrong. She mentioned it to friends. She told Nicole she felt emotionally disconnected from Chris. She said he seemed checked out, but she also said she wanted to fix it. She took Bella and Celeste to North Carolina for 6 weeks to visit her parents, giving Chris space, hoping absence would remind him what he had. With Shanann in North Carolina, Chris was essentially living with Nicole Kessinger. He was happy, genuinely, visibly happy, in a way his coworkers noticed. He seemed lighter. He started going to the gym more. He started looking at apartments. He had decided, in some internal corner of himself that he hadn't yet fully examined, that he wanted out of his marriage. What he hadn't decided, or what he refused to consciously admit, was what out was going to cost. Shanann came home on August 12, 2018. She'd been at another Thrive conference in Arizona, a late flight. She got home around 2 a.m. She and Chris talked about the marriage, about what was wrong. Shanann didn't know about Nicole Kessinger. She thought the problem was work stress and pregnancy anxiety and the distance of those 6 weeks. She went to bed. And sometime in the early hours of August 13th, while Bella and Celeste slept down the hall, something shifted in Chris Watts. What happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail in the early hours of August 13th, 2018 is known partly from physical evidence and partly from Chris Watts himself, who told at least 3 different versions of events before arriving at something approaching the truth. This is what the evidence and his final confession tell us. At some point after 3 a.m., Chris Watts strangled his wife, Shanann, in their bed. He then went down the hall to his daughter's rooms. Chris loaded the bodies of his wife and daughters into his company truck, a Ford F-250 with Anadarko Petroleum markings on the side. He drove to a remote oil field in Weld County called Survey 319, a site he managed for work. He knew exactly where the security cameras were, and he knew their angles. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near a tank battery. He was at work by 7:30 a.m. He sent a text to Shanann that morning as though she might reply. Now let's talk about the next 5 hours, because this is where the Chris Watts case becomes something beyond a simple crime story. This is where it becomes a study in the audacity of denial. When Nicole Atkinson couldn't reach Shanann, and Shanann's flight had landed, and her car was at the house, and her phone and purse were inside, Nicole called the police. Officer Scott Coonrod arrived at 1:48 p.m. Chris Watts came home shortly after, driven back from the Survey 319 site, 40 minutes away. And here is what Chris Watts did in those hours. He cried on camera. Not convincingly, investigators would later note he seemed to produce tears the way a person does when they're trying to produce tears, rather than when they can't stop them. But he cried. He gave an interview to local news station KDVR, standing on his front lawn, holding a photograph of his family. He said he just wanted his girls back. He said he wanted his babies home. He said, and this is important, "I just talked to Shanann about a separation." Not because mentioning the separation was suspicious in itself, but because that word, separation, meant the police had to start looking at him. In domestic homicide cases, the intimate partner is always the first suspect. Chris Watts knew this. He was not stupid. And yet he introduced the word separation himself, unprompted, in a television interview on the day his family disappeared. Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department conducted the first formal interview at the Watts home. Chris was cooperative, articulate, calm. Too calm, Baumhover would later say. He answered questions like someone reviewing answers he had already rehearsed. The FBI joined the case that evening. By the morning of August 14th, Chris Watts had been asked to come in for a polygraph. He agreed. He failed it, not by a small margin. And in the room afterward, with FBI Special Agent Graham Coder and lead investigator Tammy Lee, something broke open. Chris Watts confessed. He told investigators that he had confronted Shanann about the separation, that he had looked out the window and seen Shanann doing something to Bella, hurting her, that he had gone into a rage, that he had strangled Shanann, but that his daughters had already been harmed by their mother before he intervened. Investigators didn't believe him, but they had something he didn't know about, a neighbor's doorbell camera. It had captured Chris Watts' truck pulling out of the driveway at approximately 5:15 a.m. with cargo in the bed, and surveillance footage from the Survey 319 oil site, footage Chris had believed was pointed in the wrong direction, had captured him on the property. On August 15th, Chris Watts was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. On August 16th, search teams found the bodies. Bella and Celeste were recovered from the oil tanks. Shanann was found in the shallow grave. After an arrest like this, the world does what it always does. It goes looking for the monster beneath the surface. It wants an origin story, a warning sign that was missed, a crack in the foundation. Chris Watts grew up in Spring Lake, North Carolina, outside of Fort Bragg. His father, Ronnie, was a quiet man who worked with his hands. His mother, Cindy, was described by some who knew her as controlling, as emotionally unpredictable, though she was never anything but devoted to her son. His sister, Jamie, was close with Chris growing up. By all accounts, Chris was the easy child, not remarkable, not troubled. He kept to himself. He didn't get into fights. He had no history of violence. Teachers described him as agreeable, not curious, not driven, agreeable. He went along with whatever the group wanted. Psychologists who would later examine his case identified this as one of Chris Watts' defining characteristics, an almost total absence of his own will, not in the criminal sense, in the everyday sense. Chris Watts did not know what he wanted. He had spent his life agreeing with his mother, agreeing with Shanann. He had built his identity entirely around the expectations of the people closest to him. And when those expectations became unbearable, when Shanann's ambition and the mortgage and the pregnancy and the debt all pressed in, he didn't know how to push back. Nicole Kessinger represented the escape. But Chris didn't frame it to himself as, "I want to leave my marriage." He framed it as, "I need to be free," and somehow in a logic that is genuinely difficult to follow and deeply important to understand. Being free became something he believed he could not achieve through a divorce. Why? Chris Watts was afraid, not of Shanann, not of a legal battle. He was afraid of the story. Shanann had over 80,000 followers on social media who adored her. She documented her life publicly. A divorce, especially one involving a new girlfriend, would have a narrative. And in that narrative, Chris Watts knew he would be the villain. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit prepared a profile on Watts after his arrest. Their assessment described him as a passive-aggressive personality with strong suppression tendencies, low emotional intelligence, and an inability to tolerate conflict. He had no history of violence because he had always escaped conflict before it escalated, through compliance, through withdrawal, through silence. The physical evidence and the timeline suggest premeditation. The drive to Survey 319, the disposal of the bodies, the calculation of the camera angles, the immediate resumption of his workday. This was not a man who lost control. This was a man who had been quietly calculating for weeks. During the period of the affair, Chris had researched a number of things on his phone that investigators would later find significant. Real estate listings for single-bedroom apartments, the financial terms of divorce in Colorado, and at least one search for how long it takes the human body to decompose in different environments. He had not yet decided, or he had decided, but hadn't admitted it to himself. This is the dark borderland where ordinary psychology and something colder begin to blur. What is clear is that Shanann's return, her arrival back in that house, pregnant, with the girls, with all the daily weight of the life Chris had decided he didn't want, triggered something. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the story of Chris Watts did not end with sentencing, because in February 2019, FBI agents Tammy Lee and Graham Coder, along with Weld County District Attorney's investigator Mark Reich, traveled to Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin to conduct an additional interview. What happened in those rooms over multiple sessions is now publicly available as part of the case record. It is one of the most disturbing documents in modern American true crime history. Chris Watts, sitting in a prison interview room in his orange uniform, finally told investigators what he claimed was the complete truth. The story he'd told in his initial confession, that Shanann had hurt the girls and he'd snapped, was a lie. He admitted that. He said he'd constructed it because he thought it might be more sympathetic. In the February 2019 sessions, he told a new version. He said he'd been awake most of the night before, that Shanann had come home and they had talked, that she had not been angry or confrontational. In fact, he described her as calm, as trying to reach him, as asking him what was wrong. He said he lay there in the dark next to her after she fell asleep. He said it felt like he was watching himself from above, like someone else was doing it. Investigators, and every psychologist who has reviewed the transcripts since, note that this dissociative framing is extremely common in killers who struggle to integrate their actions into their self-image. Chris Watts, even in confession, could not fully own what he had done. He described going to each of his daughter's rooms. He said Bella woke up. He said she asked him what he was doing. He has never given a complete answer about what happened next. Investigators noted the pauses, the long silences on the recording that surround that particular part of his account. What the autopsy report showed is that both Bella and Celeste showed evidence of struggling. When investigators asked Chris Watts why, when a divorce was an option, when leaving was an option, when any number of imperfect but survivable choices were available, his answers were evasive and inconsistent. He talked about feeling trapped, about not seeing another way, about Shanann's social media presence making a clean break impossible, about not wanting to share custody. He said he loved his daughters. He said that more than once. What emerges from hours of those recordings is something that criminologists have pointed to as genuinely rare. A killer who is not proud, not defiant, not constructed around grandiosity or ideology. He was a frightened, passive man who had backed himself into a corner in his own mind, a corner that didn't actually exist, because divorce exists, because options existed, and made the single most catastrophic choice a human being can make. There is a segment in the interview transcripts that investigators have discussed publicly because it reveals something important about how Chris Watts processed his own actions. They asked him about the morning after, about going to work, about texting Shanann. Investigators asked him, "What were you feeling? Driving to work that morning?" He paused. That word has haunted every person who has read those transcripts because it suggests that the weight Chris Watts felt he could not carry, the mortgage, the pregnancy, the marriage, the life he'd agreed to, was a weight he had genuinely, in some broken internal calculus, decided could only be removed one way. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail was sold in a bankruptcy proceeding in 2019 for $380,000. The new owners reportedly renovated it entirely. The neighbors still think about what happened there. Shanann Watts' family, her parents, Frank and Sandy Rzucek, her brother Frankie Jr., gave a statement at the sentencing. Sandy Rzucek stood before the court and said things that no parent should ever have to say. She talked about Bella's laugh, about Celeste's habit of humming to herself when she was happy, about Shanann's voice on the phone. Nicole Kessinger, the girlfriend, cooperated fully with investigators. She had known nothing of the murders in advance and was visibly devastated during her interviews. She later gave an extended interview to a journalist, attempting to reclaim her own narrative. She has largely withdrawn from public life since. Chris Watts' parents, Ronnie and Cindy, have given occasional interviews over the years, and their grief is complicated by the fact that they still love their son while grappling with what their son did. Cindy Watts, in particular, has made statements that many found difficult, including suggestions that Shanann bore some responsibility for the breakdown of the marriage. These statements caused significant public anger, but they also reveal something true, that the families of killers are themselves victims of a kind, stranded in an impossible position of love and horror. Chris Watts is currently incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He has reportedly converted to Christianity since his imprisonment. He has given additional interviews and written letters that circulate in true crime communities. In some, he expresses remorse. In some, he seems more focused on processing his own trauma than on the people he killed. What I want to leave you with, and this is the part that gets lost in the shock of this case, in the cameras and the polygraph and the oil tanks and the neighborly smile on the front lawn, is this: 3 people are gone. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She was building something. She was imperfect and loud and ambitious, and she loved her daughters with everything she had. She deserved a divorce if that was where her marriage was going. She deserved to fight over custody and split the furniture and cry with Nicole on the phone and rebuild. Bella Watts was 4. Celeste Watts was 3. They had barely started. We live in a world where it is very easy to build a life that looks perfect from the outside, on social media, in a neighborhood, on a lawn where a news camera is rolling. We are very good at performed happiness, and sometimes the gap between what we perform and what we feel gets so wide that people stop being able to see their way across it. Chris Watts was not a monster in the traditional sense. He had no prior violence. He had no dark history. He was a man who had never learned to be honest about what he felt, who had never learned to say, "I am not happy here," who had never learned to choose discomfort over catastrophe. That is what makes this case so hard to put down. That is why you'll be thinking about it tomorrow. If you've stayed with me through all 5 chapters, thank you. This was not an easy story to sit with. It wasn't meant to be. If you found this video meaningful, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you know someone who might need to hear this story, share it.